There is a photograph taken on Via Montenapoleone in the autumn of 2024. It shows a street so polished it looks lacquered. Black stone, gold lettering, a bottega window lit like a chapel altar, a doorman in gloves, a queue of shoppers waiting to be admitted one at a time into a boutique the size of a cathedral. That street, in that year, became the single most expensive retail address on planet Earth, overtaking Fifth Avenue and the Champs-Élysées, with rents climbing past 20,000 euros per square meter and a vacancy rate of barely 1%. It looked like the absolute summit of an empire. It looked invincible. Now walk 40 minutes northeast, past the edge of the city, into the industrial belt that rings Milan, and find the other photograph from the same year. A police raid, fluorescent lights, sewing machines running through the night in a converted warehouse, migrant workers, some of whom had never made a luxury handbag before in their lives, sleeping beside the machines they operated for 14 hours a day. The bags they were assembling would sell, eventually, on that same gold-lettered street, for the price of a small car. Two photographs, the same industry, the same year. One is the mythology, the other is the machine. And the distance between them, the widening, unbridgeable distance between the storefront and the workshop, is the story of how the most admired luxury industry in the world began quietly to crack. If you want to understand how an empire built on the word craftsmanship starts to hollow out while its shop windows have never looked brighter, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the declines the industry's own glossy press is paid not to see. The numbers nobody. Framed as honestly, Italian luxury has been a kind of miracle for so long that almost nobody thought to ask whether the miracle had an expiration date. This is the country that makes, by most estimates, roughly half of the entire world's luxury goods. Not designs them, makes them. The leather, the stitching, the cashmere, the silk, the shoes, the hardware. The phrase made in Italy is not a label. It is a promise. And for 40 years it was a promise the rest of the world paid almost any price to keep. Then the numbers started to move in the wrong direction, and they moved quietly, the way the important numbers always do. In 2024, the global market for personal luxury goods contracted for the first time in 15 years, setting aside the pandemic, the first genuine non-emergency contraction since the financial crisis of 2008. The market slipped to 363 billion euros, down 2%, and the forecasts for the year that followed were worse, a further decline of 2 to 5%. That is the global picture. The Italian picture is sharper, and it is worse. Italy's fashion industry was worth approximately 104 billion euros in 2023. By 2024, it had fallen to around 90 billion. The projection for 2025 sits near 80 billion. That is a quarter of the industry's value, roughly 24 billion euros, evaporating in the space of 24 months. Not in a crash, not in a headline, in a slow, clinical bleed that the quarterly press releases were careful to describe as normalization. And here is the detail: the tourism brochures of fashion, the runway shows, the magazine covers, the influencer front rows, are structured never to mention. While the value of the industry was collapsing, the rent on Via Montenapoleone was hitting a world record. The two facts are not a contradiction. They are the diagnosis. Because what happens at the very top of an empire in its late phase is precisely this. The visible surface gleams brighter than ever, even as the foundation that produced the surface is being dismantled beneath it. You cannot see the rot beneath gold leaf. Venice taught us that. Italy's luxury houses are about to teach us again. If patterns like this fascinate you, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this kind of investigation deserves to stay visible. The factories that went dark. To understand why the empire is cracking, you have to go to the place the cameras never go. Not the boutique, the workshop. Italian luxury was never really built in Milan. Milan is the showroom. The actual making happened, and still happens, in a scatter of small family workshops across Tuscany, the Veneto, Lombardy, the March, the leather towns outside Florence, the wool weavers of Biella, the silk of Como, the shoemakers of the Riviera del Brenta. For 3 generations, these were family businesses, passed from parent to child, where a person could spend 40 years learning to do one thing: a hand-rolled edge, a particular stitch, better than almost anyone else alive. That dense, almost invisible network of artisans was the real empire. The brands were merely the names printed on what the artisans made. That network is now closing down at a rate that should be a national emergency, and is instead a footnote. In the first 3 quarters of 2024 alone, more than 2,000 Italian fashion manufacturing companies shut their doors. In the second quarter of 2025, the artisan trade group Confartigianato counted another 1,035 clothing and leather firms closing. In a single 3-month window, these are not brands you have heard of. That is exactly the point. They are the suppliers, the sub-suppliers, the workshops whose names never appear on anything. And when they vanish, the capacity to actually make the product vanishes with them, slowly, and then, as the people who run them keep warning anyone who will listen. All at once, a veteran supplier in the Tuscan leather district put it in terms that were difficult to argue with. The problem, he said, is not only the orders drying up, though they have. The problem is that when a workshop closes, the knowledge inside it does not move somewhere else. It simply stops existing. The 18-year-old who would have apprenticed there goes to work in logistics instead. And you cannot reopen that workshop in 2 years when demand returns, because the person who knew how to run it has retired, and there is no one behind them. Many factories, one industry figure told the trade press flatly, will simply disappear. This is the first crack, and it is structural, not cyclical. A cyclical problem is a bad year. A structural problem is the disappearance of the thing that made the good years possible. Italy is not having a bad year. Italy is losing the artisans, and an artisan, unlike a sales figure, does not come back when the market recovers. The wrote beneath the label. And then there is the part of the story that the industry would have paid almost anything to keep buried, because it does not merely suggest decline. It suggests fraud at the heart of the promise. Starting in 2024, prosecutors in Milan began pulling on a thread, and the thread did not stop unraveling. Investigators had spent a decade examining illegal labor in logistics and cleaning before they turned finally to the sector that defines the city: luxury. What they found, described in court documents as a generalized manufacturing method, was this. Behind some of the most prestigious names in the world sat a chain of subcontractors and sub-subcontractors that ended, in too many cases, in unmarked workshops on the outskirts of Milan where migrant workers, Chinese, Pakistani, undocumented, unprotected, worked through the night for a fraction of a legal wage, in conditions a Milanese magistrate described as putting human lives at risk to protect a profit margin. The Italian word for this is caporalato. The English approximation is something close to indentured exploitation, and the brands it reached were not obscure. A Milan court placed a unit of Christian Dior under judicial administration. It did the same to a unit of Giorgio Armani, a unit of Loro Piana. The Cashmere House, the one whose entire identity is quiet, impeccable, $10,000 restraint, was named. By the end of 2025, prosecutors had pulled 13 luxury brands into the investigation, among them Gucci, Prada, Versace, Yves Saint Laurent, Dolce & Gabbana, Ferragamo, Givenchy. The handbag that sold for the price of a car had, in some cases, cost €53 to assemble in a room where the workers slept beside their machines. Let us be precise here, because precision matters and empire falls does not traffic in simplification. Not every Italian workshop is a sweatshop. The vast majority of Italian artisans are exactly the skilled, fairly paid craftspeople the Mythology describes, and many of them are furious, more furious than any outsider, at what the cut-corner operators have done to the label they spent their lives honoring. The investigation is ongoing. Most of the named brands have not been found criminally liable. Several were cited for failing to supervise rather than for direct abuse. But the damage to the Mythology does not require a conviction. It requires only the question, now lodged permanently in the mind of every thoughtful buyer: what exactly am I paying for? Because the entire premium of Made in Italy, the reason a buyer accepts a price 4 or 5 times the cost of an equivalent object made elsewhere, rests on a single belief: that the price buys craft, that the price buys an artisan, a tradition, a human being doing something beautiful, slowly and well. Strip away that belief, reveal the migrant worker, and the €53 assembly cost beneath the €10,000 price. And what remains is not craftsmanship. It is markup. And markup, unlike craftsmanship, is something the buyer can find anywhere. The customer stopped believing the houses might have survived the supply chain scandal if the customer had stayed loyal. The customer did not stay loyal. And the reason is the second half of the same betrayal. Between 2019 In 2024, the major luxury houses raised their prices by an estimated 52%, more than double the rate of inflation over the same period. A bag that cost $2,500 before the pandemic now costs $4,000 or more, and the buyer holding it increasingly suspects that the additional $1,500 purchased nothing but the privilege of having paid it. The quality, by widespread account, did not rise 52%. In many cases, it did not rise at all. What rose was the number on the tag and the assumption that the customer would keep paying because the customer always had. The assumption was wrong. Between 2022 and 2024, the personal luxury market lost approximately 50 million customers. 50 million. These were not, for the most part, the billionaires the very top of the market held. They were the aspirational buyers. The school teacher who saved for one good handbag. The young professional who bought a single luxury item a year as a marker of having arrived. That customer, roughly 60% of the entire market by volume, looked at the new price, looked at the sweatshop headlines, performed a quiet and rational calculation, and walked away. Not in anger. In disillusionment, which is more permanent than anger, because anger fades and disillusionment simply replaces belief with arithmetic. You can watch this happen in the financials of the largest houses, with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable. At Kering, the French group, but the owner of Italy's flagship, Gucci, revenue fell 13% in 2025, the third consecutive year of decline. Gucci itself, the jewel, the engine, saw sales fall by roughly a fifth in a single year, and across just 3 years the brand's revenue nearly halved, collapsing from more than 10 billion euros to around 6. That is not a soft patch. That is a brand watching its customers decide, one rational decision at a time, that the spell has broken, and once the spell breaks, it is almost impossible to restore. A sophisticated customer with options is very good at recognizing a markup dressed as a heritage. And once they recognize it, the gold lettering on Via Montenapoleone stops reading as prestige and starts reading as a stage set. The pet and butt, the decline of Italian luxury, is not, in the end, a story only about Italy or only about handbags. It is a story about a pattern, and the pattern is older than any of these houses. The pattern is this. A place becomes famous for making something extraordinary. It monetizes the reputation of making that thing. And then slowly, it discovers that it has been selling the reputation faster than it has been making the thing. Until one day, the reputation is all that is left. And the reputation, it turns out, was always the part that could be faked. Florence, in the 15th century, did not become Florence because of the Medici Bank. It became Florence because of the guilds. The wool guild, the silk guild, the goldsmiths, dense networks of artisans whose skill was the actual source of the wealth that paid for the Renaissance. The bankers and the merchants were downstream of the makers. When we look at a Florentine palazzo today, we are looking, really, at the accumulated surplus of generations of people who knew how to make things better than anyone else in Europe. That was the empire. The beauty was the evidence of it. Italy's luxury houses have spent the last 2 decades doing something that would have been unthinkable to a 15th century guildmaster. They have treated the maker as a cost to be minimized, rather than the asset to be protected. They have outsourced the stitching to whoever would do it cheapest, financialized the heritage, raised the price on the reputation, and assumed the skill would always be there to draw on, the way one assumes the air will always be there to breathe. And now the workshops are closing. The artisans are aging out with no apprentices behind them. The prosecutors are reading court orders into the record, and the customer is doing arithmetic. Rome saw an early, milder version of this. The showrooms of the historic center, increasingly arranged for the cruise ship tourist and the photograph, rather than the resident connoisseur. Milan is the most advanced case, because Milan is where the contradiction is sharpest. The world's most expensive shopping street, 1 mile from the workshops being raided for slavery, in a country whose capacity to actually make the product is shrinking by 1,000 firms a quarter. That is not a healthy empire at its peak. That is an empire that has learned, like Venice before it, how to make its decline look like elegance. ACTVI. What comes next, what happens next, is the question the houses themselves are least equipped to answer honestly, because the honest answer requires admitting that the model is the problem. There are, broadly, 2 roads. On the first road, the houses treat this as a cyclical dip. Wait for the Chinese consumer to return. Wait for the American buyer to absorb the tariffs threatening 12 billion euros of Italian exports. Hold the prices, manage the headlines, and assume that mythology will hold one more time, the way it always has. This is the road of denial. And it is the road every empire takes first, because it is the only road that requires no one in charge to admit they were wrong. On the second road, the houses do the difficult, expensive, unglamorous thing. They bring the making back in-house. They pay the artisans enough to make the trade worth entering again. They build the training academies, some have already, tellingly, begun to build, and they reset the price to something the disillusioned customer can once again believe in. This road rebuilds the foundation. It is also a direct admission that the foundation was allowed to crack, and it costs margin that shareholders have been promised would only ever rise. You already know which road most of them will take first, and so Italy's luxury empire will not collapse in a single season. There will be no morning when the lights go out on Via Montenapoleone. The street will gleam for years yet. The shows will go on. The magazine covers will keep promising craftsmanship. But beneath the gold leaf, the count will continue. Another 100 workshops dark. Another generation of artisans retiring with no one trained to replace them. Another aspirational customer who decides the 8th handbag will simply be a good handbag from somewhere honest. Another quarter, where the rent on the storefront rises while the value of the empire behind it falls. Empires do not fall in a day. They fall in patterns. And the pattern, once you have learned to read it, you cannot stop seeing. Tell us in the comments which luxury capital you think cracks next. Paris with its houses propped on the same arithmetic, or somewhere no one is watching yet. And subscribe, because the next chapter of Empire Falls is already built. And the empire we are looking at next has been calling itself eternal for a very long time.